Very distinguished, and I know they don't like me saying that about them, but they are speakers here today. First of all, we've got Dr. Breach Rafferty, who undertook her doctoral work at Queen's in Belfast, and her thesis was entitled Caught in the Crossfire, Catholic Religious Sisters and the Northern Irish Troubles, 1968 to 2008. And Breach managed to get an impressive number of oral history interviews, the results of which she's going to talk to you about today. And our second speaker is Dr. Diane Kirby, who's an eminent historian of the Cold War and religion in the Cold War. And she's bringing that expertise to bear on the role of religion in Northern Ireland. And I'm very pleased to say she's also a research associate here at Las Casas. So they're now going to speak to you today about Sisters and the Troubles. Sure, what did the nuns do?
Good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to present our research here today. As Maria has outlined, this oral history project offers an insight into the lives of Catholic sisters in Northern Ireland during an historical time frame commonly known as the Troubles, 1968 to 2008. Specifically, it uncovers the diversity and scope of sisters' ministries in the areas of social activism, education, healthcare, and peace and reconciliation. And I begin today's paper with a brief background to this work, including some of the difficulties we faced. And I then focus on aspects of the research which encapsulate the challenges individual sisters faced in the grassroots and in some of the worst areas affected by violence. The voices of sisters are heard throughout this paper, and as they revisit traumatic events such as the deaths of pupils or threats to their own safety, you will get a sense of the immense psychological and personal impact of violence, the painful legacy of conflict. From the signing of the Northern Ireland Good Friday Agreement in 1998, numerous oral history projects, such as Healing Through Remembering, have captured the experiences of those from both sides of the political and social divide during and since the Troubles. And the treatment previously accorded the religious dimension of the conflict has provoked debate, with traditional historical narratives tending to focus on the contribution of male clergy, whilst the voices of women religious are rarely heard. The omission of these voices from the historiography of the conflict could lead to the active roles of sisters within such a troubled society going virtually unnoticed. Indeed, as the title suggests, on more than one occasion I have been asked, sure, what did the nuns do? So this project shows what many sisters did then, why they did it, and what they continue to do. And the ministries of these women who merged religious commitment with action places them central to the practical application of Vatican II on the ground in Northern Ireland. This research challenges official histories which have excluded or ignored the roles of women religious, and provides an original gendered element to the historiography of religion on the island of Ireland in the latter part of the 20th century. It deepens our understanding of the Catholic Church during the Troubles, and importantly, it offers an alternative and often unseen history of religious sisters in Ireland. Oral historian Anna Bryson rightly posits, there are few things more powerful than the authentic voice of experience. It doesn't always come through, but when it does, it never ceases to move, to humble, and to help us more deeply and more generously to understand the past. So I conducted interviews, one-to-one oral interviews with 30 sisters, plus numerous informal discussions with sisters from 11 religious institutes, and I'm extremely grateful for their contribution. Interviews were also carried out with Catholic priests, former political prisoners, former colleagues, and pupils of individual sisters. However, I do not propose that this is a definitive representation of all sisters in their communities in Northern Ireland, because despite requests, contemplative institutes did not participate. Yet it is important to remember that prayer was vital, and contemplatives such as the Poor Clares, through the Ministry of Presence, assisted local communities by opening their doors or their parlour to provide prayer with and provide listening spaces during these years. So conducting an oral history project, especially one which recovers difficult histories, has many challenges. By the very nature of religious life, sisters do not wish to draw attention to themselves, and they certainly do not want praise. undoubtedly a fear of speaking out persists for many, which may be attributed to the sensitive nature of this research and the era it was undertaken, when fear of speaking out on troubles-related matters and the ongoing historical abuse scandals involving the Catholic Church in Ireland were commonplace. But ethical concerns, especially trust, were vital to this project. And as this evolved over a period of time, my biographical background was crucial to the process. With a name that alludes to my Irish Catholic identity, I was born during the 1960s and grew up in the predominantly nationalist town of Newry, County Down, where I experienced the conflict at first hand and thus have an insider's perspective of the struggles of the era. I was educated by the Poor Clares and later worked as a nurse in a hospital run by St. John of God Hospital of Sisters in Newry. So I argue that complete objectivity is impossible because of my own cultural experience. However, research transparency, periods of prolonged negotiations undoubtedly reassured some of the sisters and influenced their willingness to participate. And these testimonies are supported by archival material. Although access to some convent archives was hampered by institutional reluctance, others, such as the Society of the Sacred Heart Sisters, opened their archives, and individual sisters such as Bon Secours, Concilia Dennehy, generously donated personal papers, diaries, whilst other sisters provided their own academic studies. And all these resources were vital to support the sisters' narratives. From the outset, and above all, I was mindful that the sisters must be viewed within the context of a troubled time and place. As Graham Dawson explains, trauma is in part caused when the past continues to torment because it is not the past. It's not over, finished, completed, but permeates the social and psychic realities of everyday life in the present. But storytelling can bring painful memories which were buried deep in the psyche to the surface. And 1968 is a pivotal year in the history of transnational revolt and is the starting point for this research, a period when Northern Ireland society succumbed to a violent conflict which lasted for over 30 years. During this time, more than 3,600 people lost their lives, and an estimated 40 to 50,000 suffered serious injuries. There were almost 2,000 unsolved deaths. 186 children were killed between Patrick Rooney, aged 9, in August 1969, and Michael McIlveen, aged 15, in May 2006. 18 of these children, 10%, were fatally injured in their own homes. Many more were killed on the streets outside. And among the casualties of the Troubles was one religious sister, Catherine Dunn from the Order of St. Louis, who died in an IRA roadside bomb explosion in Middletown, County Armagh on the 24th of July, 1990. And 3 policemen also lost their lives that day. And the escalation of this societal conflict coincided with ongoing transformation within the Catholic Church, as theological directives which emanated from the ecumenical message of the Second Vatican Council encouraged individual religious sisters into prophetic action, doing God's work through their active engagement with contemporary society during these years. Adhering to the conciliar imperative to read the signs of the times, members of religious communities, some of which had been founded before the 19th century, return to their original roots and revisit the spirit of the founder or foundress through their charism and the way it shaped spirit, purpose, ministry, and structures. Religious communities in Northern Ireland moved cautiously towards modernisation, incorporating changes in the structures of their institutes, how they prayed, where they lived, and the modification of the habit. And sisters who relocated from convents into local communities connected to the social conditions of the era and began to work not only for the people, but with and among the people. But these were challenging times, and struggles were felt in the grassroots by sisters, working as they did in some of the most deprived and oppressed areas, assisting families, educating children, and often subjected to intrusion from British soldiers and the RUC, as well as intimidation from competing Republican and Loyalist paramilitary groupings. And it was against this backdrop of continuing mayhem that Mother Teresa and her sisters arrived into Ballymurphy, West Belfast, in October 1971. And the sisters were often photographed going about their daily routines. And as their gender made them more accessible than male clergy, they were accepted by women in the area who needed practical support. Writing in 1974, local curate Father Des Wilson recorded how the sisters went about their pastoral ministry, working quietly, learning a great deal about the situation, forming relationships with amazing rapidity. There were classes in needlework, typing, singing, and discussion groups involving young people and their parents. By the end of the year, it seemed that the experiment was a happy one, Wilson recorded. The actions of these sisters shows how their presence benefited the local community, not only practically, but as Wilson noted, they also helped, quote, confound the hostile press who tried to depict Ballymurphy as solely a derelict ghetto. In short, they made the people of Ballymurphy feel good about themselves. However, within 18 months, the sisters had gone, and events surrounding their abrupt departure were recorded by journalist John Cooney at the time as the most significant Irish ecclesiastical mystery of 1973. The sisters themselves stated it was time just to move on. However, Des Wilson suggested that the concept of having missionaries in their midst caused great shame to certain members of the local clergy, who were of the mindset that, quote, the Irish sent missionaries to countries in need, not the other way around. As he explained, unfortunately, there was an undercurrent in Belfast, to put it very, very gently, an unwillingness to be too trusting of people from other races, other countries and races especially. So whilst these sisters met with some resistance, others were empowered to exert agency and challenge church and societal perceptions. And this was particularly evident in the schools. Unlike teaching communities based in schools throughout the other parts of the United Kingdom, sisters in Northern Ireland, or in the Republic of Ireland for that matter, sisters in Northern Ireland found themselves caught up in extraordinary conditions. And as the violence intensified and pupils arrived to school heavily burdened, the classroom provided respite from the mayhem beyond school perimeters. In many areas, fear and the issue of sectarianism pervaded all aspects of life. Identification of the other side was made by a person's name, the street they lived on, and the school they attended. And the school uniform identified children as either Protestant or Catholic. And these factors contributed to emphasizing stereotypical ideals, and thus for some, the educational system was to the fore in reflecting and reinforcing sectarian division. And before the introduction of integrated education during the 1980s, education in Northern Ireland was distinct due to the segregation of pupils on religious grounds, with most children attending either predominantly Protestant-controlled schools or Catholic-maintained schools. Catholic identity was in part reflected through the educational system in terms of what Marianne Elliott has described as a package deal. And in this deal, many children are socialized into cultural aspects of Catholic life, including the Irish language, participation in Gaelic games, religious education, which facilitated preparation for receiving the sacraments of the Catholic Church. And as educators, many sisters became representatives of their local communities and subsequently connected to their struggles, yet few were prepared for such important roles. As one sister told me, she was sent from the south to work as a principal in a school in the north with no induction into the educational system, and she was completely dependent on her fellow teaching staff and lay staff. However, the commitment to education attracted another one of the interviewees, theologian Geraldine Smith, and she was attracted to the Dominican order. As she explained, it felt like a spiritual home. It kind of came to me as in terms of some of the tradition and values and respect for every person. An education approach that was open and broad and that tapped into people's potential. So the efforts of religious institutes who ran schools in the north of Ireland since the 19th century, such as the Dominican Society of the Sacred Heart, Mercies, Loreto, these sisters, many communities identified access to education as a way forward and a way out of the poverty cycle for the Catholic community. And Northern Ireland had the highest unemployment rate throughout the United Kingdom during the 70s and the 80s. And as the violence intensified, both communities were subject to economic deprivation. There's evidence that many sisters who associated the powerlessness and the social injustice facing Catholics with the colonial struggles for liberation theology, the theology of the oppressed, which grew out of the turbulent years of the 1960s, and its dominant principle, the preferential option for the poor. There was an awareness that class division was as prevalent as religious division. This was particularly evident in schools where pupils from working class areas were more likely to be affected by homes being raided or fathers or brothers being interned than those girls from the grammar schools. So communities of sisters began to instigate change to assist children and families from poorer economic conditions. And one of these sisters was daughter of charity Genevieve O'Farrell, principal of St. Louise's Comprehensive School in West Belfast from 1963 to 1988. And she was especially concerned with, quote, education and liberating the poor from a mood of passive despair. She opposed the selection process, claiming it separated 11-year-olds into first-class sheep and second-class goats. The school uniform was affordable for all, and there were no school fees. Anyone who wished to attend her school could. And any local clergy who questioned her approach were reminded, this isn't a second-class school for second-class people. Indeed, cultural activities for her pupils were wide-ranging, from reciting Irish verse in local fish to school productions of operatic classics, leading to one former pupil to exclaim, quote, the Mikado for Christ's sake in the Falls. Indeed, O'Farrell's biographer, John Ray, argues that she personified the new face of an Irish religious sister. She was everything conservative priests feared nuns and sisters might become: assertive, independent, and feminist. However, Daughters of Charity were not the only religious institute to forge ahead. During the 1970s, the Society of the Sacred Heart Sisters in Armagh also rejected the divisive nature of the 11+ system, and led by school principal Dolores Considine, had a vision for an all-ability, all-social background school. And they began the process of amalgamation between their grammar schools, which had borders, and secondary schools in Armagh, in order to provide equal educational opportunities for all pupils. St. Catherine's College opened in 1973. So to quote former principal Aidan Kinlan, Dolores Considine felt strongly that kids are branded at the age of 11 as failures, with hang-ups for the rest of their lives. They don't get the employment possibilities that grammar school kids have, and it's just not just. And the actions taken by these sisters was a direct response to the injustice and inequality experienced by the Catholic community, and the hope that their pupils would use their education for personal betterment. As Kinnan explains, if you're a failure at 11, you're going to be against the government. You're not going to get the education that gives you good judgment, independent of movements. It was the only way forward for Catholics. They didn't have money, they didn't have land, but education was their resource for bettering themselves and for their own personal human dignity. But the process of amalgamation was difficult, in part because of immense opposition from the parents of grammar school pupils, who were equally aware of social class and conversely wished to maintain the obvious distinction. As Jesuit priest Brian Lennon, who worked closely with the sisters, commented Considine's efforts as extraordinary. However, he admitted, I wouldn't in a million years have attempted it because it's a no-goer, not going to work. You'll be slaughtered in the meantime. I mean, the amalgamation of two institutions is slaughter, then the class bias coming into it in the middle of the troubles in Armagh, but she did it. And the efforts of these sisters in schools located in predominantly Catholic areas is significant. And whilst there was an element of risk associated with teaching in these schools, sisters who worked in Protestant or loyalist hotspots lacked the security that a nationalist area could offer. And there's evidence relating to the experiences of the Sisters of Mercy in Our Lady of Mercy Girls' Secondary School, Ballysill in Belfast, substantiates this argument. The former principal of the school, Sister of Mercy, tendered a report which she compiled on the history of sectarian attacks on the school from the late 1960s to 2001, and it lists 1976 as the worst year for the school, with 3 pupils murdered during one school term by loyalist paramilitaries. A quote from the report: 3 pupils deliberately shot dead at point-blank range, 2 while dressed in school uniform. Anne McGee, aged 15, Carol McMenemy, aged 15, and Geraldine McCone, aged 14. The report describes the 1980s as a decade marked by petrol bombs, arson attacks, bullets delivered to the school, teachers under threat and advised to stagger their route home. And also there was attacks on teachers' cars, but the personal risk to individual sisters was evident when the RUC informed the principal that she was on a loyalist assassination list. This threat lasted for approximately 4 months, during which time a police escort was provided to take her to and from school every day. In 2001, the principal concluded her report, stating, despite the long, difficult years there has been with all those associated with Our Lady of Mercy, a strong conviction that this school must remain open to show by word and example that love is the only answer. hatred and revenge can have no place in our solution. But distrust of the other side persisted, and with its episodes of sectarian violence, yet it was business as usual within the school perimeters, with many sisters were consistent in their efforts to unite a divided society and to avoid the perpetuation of generational sectarianism. These sisters encouraged the development of mutual understanding between children of different religious persuasions, and they strove to avoid the militarization of children in their care. Measures taken, including developing the curriculum to include the history of unionism, organizing school trips for Catholic and Protestant children together, arranging inter-school activities such as musicals, choirs, school clubs, and school assemblies were opportunities to tell pupils, don't join any organization, stay away from crowds, love your enemies, have forgiveness, because Protestant tears are the same as Catholic tears. And in their submission to the Opsal Commission in 1992, Cross and Passion sisters advocated that the integrated education system would provide the basis for getting to know the other side. Yet Loretto's sister Anne Kilroy, who was one of the first sisters to work in the integrated school system, recalled how it was difficult to convince some members of the male clergy, as, quote, the idea of a Catholic nun going into an integrated school seemed to be almost like a traitor. Though Kilroy had the full support of her religious community, other sisters were restricted by the expectations of their institutes. As one explained, if I'd been allowed, I would have been wanting to go into integrated educations, but the expectation in the order was I would be in our own schools, and I was the last teaching sister. I knew there'd be nobody else coming, so that was a huge sort of dilemma. And even the practicalities of conducting lessons were altered as a result of the conflict. A Mercy sister recalled her naivety at giving these children homework. They had come in, sister, I didn't get the homework done. Well, what happened? Oh, the Brits came in and searched our house last night, or the provosts were doing a kangaroo court. I'd stopped giving any homework. There wasn't any point. The kids were living in this kind of environment. What was I thinking of? That was the end of homework, so everything had to be done during the day. The reality is many children were seen as easy targets in the absence of parents or siblings, through death or incarceration or the early indoctrination of them in the home. Children were coerced into acts of violence and often turned their allegiance to gangs who would provide a sense of shared identity. Helen Brocklehurst argues that the militarization of children was deemed a cumulative process, originating in the acceptance of violence as a means to an end. It often concluded with the mobilization of children as members of paramilitary organizations. In fact, I have there's an image in Ballymurphy donated by the local people in proud and loving memory of all those volunteers from the area who lost their lives in that fight for Irish freedom. And among these volunteers, her marked, is the death of one volunteer, Kathy McCartland, aged 12, who died the 12th of the 8th, 73. Indeed, the death of a child had an immense, really indescribable impact on the wider community. And as one sister relived the death of one of her pupils, the impact of human loss came through in the interviews. Emma was 13, a pupil at St. Catherine's College, when she was killed with her grandfather Barney in a roadside bomb explosion in Benburb in 1988. And the school principal, Aidan Kinnan's testimony recalling these deaths embodied what can only be described as an historical pain. Emma was 13, she was a leader, and she was the best camogie player. The car in a field, remains of bodies. I'll never forget that morning going into school. I couldn't handle it. And the staff found it very difficult to know how to handle the pupils because they were hysterical. Here was Emma, she was here yesterday, great fun, and now she's dead. And despite her grief, Kinlan, as school principal, had to face the media. The news is out, the radio's on. Oh my God, they want to speak to the principal, what am I going to say? I didn't feel up to it. I don't know what I said, but I did dare to speak about forgiveness, as the only way forward is forgiveness. And that was insensitive of me in a way because of Emma's mummy. She'd lost her father and she'd lost her daughter. But I said, we're not going anywhere with this. We have to learn another way. We have to learn. And Aidan Kinlan described Emma's funeral in vivid detail. It was November, it was snow, it was black sky, freezing. And here are these little kids in their camogie uniforms, their little shorts, standing shivering. She said, I feel close to tears even thinking of it, I really do. So this emotive narrative places teaching sisters central to the offence of the conflict, shows how some experienced pain and loss like so many other women, but with little support. The personal impact was immense. As one sister recalled, there was a lot of trauma. I mean, we didn't use the word trauma, but looking back, I think in the last maybe 20 years since the Good Friday Agreement, we've been able to kind of get some perspective. I think there's a lot of religious suffered from burnout of one kind or another and coped with it variously. Yet another sister's narrative revealed support was not forthcoming from her religious community. She recalled her mother's superior instructed her, don't talk about anything, don't talk about the troubles, I don't want the sisters disturbed. And because of this enforced silence, sisters living together in community had no insight into the invisible burdens that each carried. And this sister likened the pressures of the environment to a schizoid situation, explaining how all of this was internalized. There wasn't any way you could talk about it. You could talk about people suffering, political stuff, but not us. It was the shock of the brutality of it all and the shame of it. And I couldn't speak about that shame in the house. And this sister got professional help, and it aided her recovery. And during many silences, I sensed that several sisters, not all of them, were possibly for the first time processing events that had happened more than 40 years ago. And in revisiting these incidents, they were reconnecting, not with an historical crisis, but with a part of their being and what Kramer describes as their ongoing reality. And I was surprised that the language of trauma and psychological distress was so prominent. And I realized that I was collecting evidence of neglect by various religious communities. And whilst I know the very nature of religious life centers on service, looking after others often took precedence over looking after themselves or their fellow sisters. And silence surrounding psychological illness can be associated with shame. And while several sisters sought help as a consequence of lack of support, awareness, or understanding, I realized that several, like so many other women in Northern Ireland, became silent victims of the Troubles. So to conclude, by publicly documenting their experiences, including their personal struggles, these sisters make unique contributions to the collective memory of the past. And it is important that these voices are heard. Without these testimonies, there is an incomplete picture of the Northern Ireland Troubles. Through the Ministry of Presence, these sisters were part of public and collective expressions of suffering. And despite risks to their own personal safety, it was often their leadership which drew others together with a shared vision for peace and reconciliation. In the final analysis, therefore, I contend that the religious of this study, to quote Margaret McGuinness, had simply done what the Church had asked of them. The Association of Leaders of Missionaries and Religious of Ireland, AMRI, the general report for 2020 recorded 6,940 Catholic sisters in Ireland, with only 443 under the age of 60. Sisters who played pivotal roles in the welfare of local communities, such as the Bon Secours, have withdrawn from the North. Thus, preserving the historical record of these women takes on a new urgency. Finally, speaking about schools in the North, Bishop Donald McComb noted recently, despite the years of violence, our schools are not some quaint relic from a divided past, but are important to the reconciliation process and the common good. And I argue that this legacy can in part be attributed to the efforts of sisters who provided important psychological, social, and cultural support for children throughout the worst years of violence. As a former pupil of the Sisters of Mercy summarized, their ministry didn't stop at 3:30 when they finished school as teachers. Their ministry continued where it was needed, in the darkest hours, in the darkest places, in the darkest situations. That's where those women were, and that's where those women continue to be, and they don't say a word about it. Thank you for listening. I'll hand you over to Diane.
Right. Well, at least I don't have to worry about the technology, whether or not it's going to work, because my paper was very focused on showing you clips from the witness seminars that are the origins of both Bríse's research and this whole project. And the main aim of the project has been to give voice to religious women whose voices in the main haven't been heard. And it had been my intent to let you view clips from our witness seminar recordings. So there's a certain irony in not being able to do so, especially as one of the themes of what I want to talk about is the silence and the silencing of religious women. But it does seem, as Bríse can testify, that whenever we do a joint presentation, something always goes wrong.
the first time we gave a presentation on women religious Catholic sisters, almost 7 years ago now. It was at a 3-day conference at the Loyola Institute in Dublin on the church and the modern world. There were dozens of papers in parallel panels. Ours was the only paper on Catholic sisters. So I anticipated a healthy attendance and was shocked when the packed room allocated us, which included a cardinal in the audience, vacated when it was our turn. Only a few sisters remained. One of which was so distressed, she sobbed throughout the presentation, sorrowfully asking at the end where everybody had gone. So today's technical hitch in comparison is perhaps not so bad. However, it was my intention to play a clip from the Witness Seminar. So I'm going to briefly ad-lib and explain what they are to show you how the project started and how it worked. So I can't do the Irish accent and I can't do all the various things, because what you see if you either look or listen to some of the witness seminars, and the idea of the witness seminar was we brought together originally Catholic sisters, but subsequently other people, other religious women that they worked in tandem with. And we brought them together to talk about their experiences of the Troubles. So basically it was like oral history, a bottom-up project to give voice to those who normally are not given voice to. And we didn't really have any sort of designated outcome, because we didn't really know what we were going to hear. So it worked, and that's what the clips would have shown you, that you could see. I think the first time we had about 20 sisters turn up. Only 9 of them actually talked, but we had 9 of them in a room. We didn't have any specific questions. We sort of threw an idea in there that sisters were risk takers, and then let them debate it. And that's where certainly the one clip that I wanted that actually informs this paper, but I'll try and give you some sense of what it was all about. But they had very different views. So that was the idea that a dynamic would be created in which women who don't want to talk about themselves, but would talk about other people. And that was a conversation about what they could remember and their different experiences to try and get some sense of what was going on. So the clip that I was going to show, which is a sister, Liz Smith, and it was from I think it was from the very first seminar. And what you saw, particularly in her discussion, and if anybody wants to contact us, we'll send you all the links so that you can watch them afterwards. And please do watch them afterwards, because the whole point of them was there's a power there that I think, Breeze, you did a fantastic job of conveying the trauma and the pain, etc. But when you actually watch people and watch them making recollections, because there were tears, there was laughter, there was a whole range of emotions that you can't replicate by giving a paper, and certainly I can't replicate. So you really do need, even if you just watch one little clip, but watching them in the whole gives you a sense of who these women were and what they were trying to do, and their modesty in particular. So this idea of being risk takers was completely rejected by those on the ground. But Liz Smith, from that particular clip, she wasn't there to talk about what she had done. She was born in Belfast, born in the Falls Road, part of a very deprived community. And she was there to say, this is what these sisters did for me and for my generation. And she stressed that. She stressed it was the generation, and this is a woman who was born in 1964, but for her generation, these sisters were paramount in what they did. For her, one of a family of 12, born into the Falls Road with very little prospects, but they gave you prospects. They made you feel valued. They made you feel that you could have a life beyond the community that you were born into. But more importantly, she said they stayed with us. And she now herself is a teacher working with a very deprived community, not in a conflict zone, although some people would argue it could be called a conflict zone. And one of the things she stressed was, I stay with my pupils because those sisters stayed with me. They never walked away. And then she just talked about, but she talked so movingly about that experience as a young person, that at the time she just took for granted they were there. And you didn't think about it because they just were there, looking after you when bombs went off. Somewhere you could go, somebody you could turn to. And actually, in another witness seminar, one of the sisters talked about when they said, she said, all I would want, if people think about us at all, is that they say about us, we stayed with the people. So this is very important in understanding their motivations. And so I wanted to start by particularly stressing, this emotion from Miss Smith, not there to talk about her role as a sister, but the role that those sisters played in her community. But the other thing that she stressed, and this is very important in the direction that this project has since taken, was, but they weren't alone. They were working in tandem with other people. And it's these networks in particular that I wanted to focus on. Because this message from the sisters wasn't just, well, we didn't do anything very much really, we were just there. They always wanted to stress what other people did, but of course they're working with them. They did it together. So this was a message constantly reiterated by the sisters throughout the project, and it becomes very important to the direction that we subsequently took, and the direction in which we went. So to clarify, the project started as an oral history project, collecting the experiences of Catholic sisters, and that was its exclusive focus at that time. But it evolved far beyond anything that we initially imagined it would. And it is, what it's revealed in particular is that religious women played a crucial role in confronting, subverting, and eventually ending the mayhem and the murder of what was a long, dirty, vicious war. Because although the Northern Ireland conflict is referred to as a low-level intensity conflict, believe me, when you're living amongst it, it didn't seem low level. So what the project has done in effect is shine a light on a dimension of the conflict, networks of grassroots activism that is badly neglected in Trouble's historiography. And moreover, and I think this again is important in determining the future direction of the conflict. The conversations and stories we collected, you can see have universal application in terms of excavating the hidden stories of armed insurgencies globally. And they're particularly important in grasping the realm of giving voice to and helping empower the marginalized and neglected, because that's where these sisters were working. They're working with the marginalized and neglected, and they're not speaking for them. They're helping them, they're empowering them to speak for themselves. So this is really important. We as a project want to give voice to these women, but their project was to give voice to these communities that they worked with. Now, the first departure of the project from its original exclusive focus on Catholic sisters derived, as I said, from the emphasis that they themselves placed on being part of a collective endeavor that embraced their female counterparts in other Christian denominations who shared, and this is important, they shared the same values, concerns, and goals. So while the sisters wanted to emphasize we weren't alone and named everybody else who was working, what we wanted to focus on the women, and we wanted to focus on the religious dimension. So we wanted to look at other women who were equally motivated by faith convictions. So this is what we started to do. Look at the women, the other religious women that they were working with. Now, unfortunately for us, these other women shared the same reluctance as the Catholic sisters to actually talk to us about themselves. And they had the same sense of, well, we didn't do anything that important. But oral historians are already, it's well documented, well acquainted with the disinclination of women generally. They don't want to talk about themselves, and they don't value sufficiently their activities. But in religious women, particularly Northern Ireland's religious women, this is a trait that's amplified many times over. Now, their level, to give you some indication of, because this was a big problem, as Briege has indicated, their level of self-effacement proved so effective that feminist scholars whose raison d'etre, who were committed to highlighting the roles of women in the conflict, managed to miss them entirely. Northern Ireland's feminist scholars called out the country's entrenched misogyny and the way women's multifaceted roles had been written out of Trouble's history. Feminist scholars complained that women had been rendered invisible. So in effect, therefore, prior to this project, religious women were the invisible of the invisible. Now, most still are, because more declined to participate in the project than actually agreed. And this is very important, in all fairness, they had very compelling reasons. And foremost was fear of repercussions, even to this day, not on themselves, but on people who are still living and working in these same communities that they were working and still are working in. And that same reason, fear of repercussions, caused other contributors who did participate to either withdraw some or all of their testimony. So the long shadow of the Troubles has been a significant impediment to this project throughout. Now, Northern Ireland's silences have been famously captured by the poet Seamus Heaney, who enshrined the combatant community command, whatever you say nothing. Now, we also refer to governed tongues. So the cessation of violence, or to some extent, the cessation of violence in terms of direct conflict using Kalashnikovs, etc., that followed the 1998 Good Friday Agreement, very discernibly shifted the conflict to the cultural arena. So combat, if you will, commenced over historical memory, making tongues even more guarded as the battle of narratives rendered unwelcome recollections that deviated from the prevailing male-dominated and all too often self-serving portrayals of the past. Now, checking, as all historians here and all scholars know, checking and confirming research via other sources is good practice. However, in a context where new and alternative, and most certainly anything regarded as a counter-narrative, these sorts of things are discouraged. Trying to check the stories that we were hearing and the facts of was shall we say, it was a challenge, and certainly often required ambushing key figures at public events because they don't respond to your emails. But when you turn up and you stand in front of them and there's other people, they won't, you haven't got time to do a proper interview, but they will give you enough so that you can confirm, yes, this happened, I know this person, etc., etc. But obviously this is something that demands patience and persistence, and I have to say remains an ongoing process. So watch out for us, Briege. Now, Briege mentioned as well that church scandals having deterred some participants, and the project itself was actually subjected to criticism for focusing on areas other than the Magdalen laundries, mother and baby homes, and so forth. Plus, some feminist scholars were actually resistant to our research findings simply because they themselves have been imbued with negative perceptions of religious women as ciphers of ultra-conservative, regressive institutions that oppress women. So we were in a sort of like, if you will, a context where the very people we thought would be receptive to the work weren't receptive to the work. And you're doing something that is incredibly valid and as I said earlier on, has universal application. But it's like, well, why are you looking at that? You should be looking at something that actually is very negative and is a minority, shall we say, aspect, if you're looking at church history generally. So history writing and research requires objectivity, obviously, but it does require an examination of the good as well as the bad and the ugly. And that's how it seemed. It seemed that, oh, you're looking at the places and incidents and events and people that represent the good part of the church. And somehow that's not acceptable. You've got to focus on the bad part. So now, obviously, you can't forgo the first, the good, in favour of the latter, because otherwise significant chunks of history will be irretrievably lost, particularly when your main source is oral history. When all the good ones die and all you've documented of the bad events in the church, then it's going to skew your whole perception of the role of the church on a much wider basis. Now, what we have so far uncovered shows that through both presence and activism during the Troubles, religious women became a factor in creating the climate on the ground and the depth of communications between the warring parties that facilitated reconciliation. They became party to the difficult and dangerous labour within working class communities. And that's, as Bree said, that class dimension is very, very important. So they're party to working within working class communities that noted international peace builders credited their work, credited with preventing the Troubles from degenerating into civil war. So what we're looking at here is something that religious women generally, Catholic sisters, obviously key to our research, play a really, really important role that just isn't recognised at all. Now, the witness seminars revealed a network of religious women of different denominations working together in a wide range of peace-building roles. Their spiritual presence amidst the suffering, their solidarity, as Bree pointed out, with all victims, their resistance to combatant control and coercion, quietly challenged and subverted paramilitary strategies, legitimation strategies that were informed by religio-political myths and sacrificial discourses. So in effect, just being there, they were a daily reminder that life was sacred, children were precious, education, everyday living mattered. Now, ironically, their ability to take risks and cross community boundaries was facilitated by the invisibility and marginalisation imposed on them by community power brokers, reflecting wider societal attitudes that are dismissive of women generally. So if you will, they use their weakness and societal attitudes that, well, they're just we women, what will they be doing? And they transformed it into a strength. They used their invisibility to be able to do things that otherwise other people would not have been able to do. Now, as the research accumulated, we realized that the unfolding stories were new not just to Bree and myself, but also revealed previously unknown aspects to the participants themselves. Because remember, they're working in often very isolated. Oh, that's my phone because I'll switch off, sorry. You know, they're doing their thing in their own community, and because you're working in a conflict situation, so you have to be very careful who you tell what to. So you know what you're doing, and it's a bit basically on a need to know basis. So very often they didn't know the full story, even of things that they were involved in. And what I want to do is give you a very telling example, and that's the Presbyterian minister, Leslie Carroll. Now, the very first witness seminar she attended, she revealed that she had become involved in the highly sensitive and secret peace-building initiatives emanating from Clonard Monastery. Now, these involved high-ranking combatants or paramilitaries, their political wings and politicians. The Clonard talks are now acknowledged as critical to the process that led to the Good Friday Agreement. Carroll worked closely alongside their key architect, Redemptorist priest Alec Reid. A great deal has now been written about Reid, his fellow Redemptorist Jerry Reynolds, and indeed most of the men involved. Invariably, I might add, with no mention of any female participation, let alone that of religious women. Yet what we were able to establish via the witness seminars is that religious women were the first and for a long time the only female participants in these critical talks. Now, in Carol's initial recounting, she emphasised that the opportunity for women to contribute to the peace talks was by the invitation of men, because she was very much, we have to give them credit, they invited us. However, in a later witness seminar, she was to learn that far from the men having recognised the value or even the necessity of including women, it was religious women who were aware of these talks. And these women belonged to the Clonard community, which was an ecumenical reconciliation group separate from the churches. But they were aware of the talks, and they demanded that they would be given a voice in the process. You've got to have women there. And they recalled the pressure they put on Father Jerry Reynolds, and I quote, "We had him tortured." Obviously not literally, just by nagging him all the time. Now, significantly here, it was Reynolds who approached Leslie Carroll. She thought on the initiative of the other priests and the paramilitaries, etc. But actually, there was other women that were responsible for women taking part. Now, being approached by a Catholic priest to meet the IRA and in a monastery shocked Carol. I quote, "Jerry Adams was the devil incarnate. The priests were the only next thing to the devil incarnate. So it was a horrifying thought, yet a moment of wonderful opportunity." Now, the sentiment expressed in that last phase, a moment of wonderful opportunity, highlights the premium that religious women placed on obedience to God. It was a priority that moved them to transcend denominational and doctrinal differences and sectarian divides. It required reaching out to each other and to the other side with love and forgiveness. However difficult, because they made no secret that this is a very difficult process. But it was these ingredients, their faith, that created the bond that distinguished and marked marked the mission of religious women. Now, I quote Carol emphasizing, as did others, the importance in particular of love. I quote, "This business of loving enemies mattered to me. That wasn't something that I understood Jesus to just say as a kind of a throwaway. You might think about loving your enemies. That's where your evangelical Protestant tradition really works for you. That was a command that I had to obey." Now, the prevailing scholarly consensus is that during the conflict, the church has failed to provide leadership. On the ground, however, religious women were part of a strong prophetic presence that led them to become party to personal, societal, and political reconciliation, critical agents for change, and effective peace builders. Now, the extent of their activities was neatly summed up by Quaker Anne Bennett, because they worked very closely with the Quakers as well. And as she put it in the title of her book, their activities ranged from dining with diplomats to praying with gunmen. Now, the project established that religious women's presence in the Clonard talks contributed to breaking the deadlock when they descended into the familiar patterns of each side blaming the other, with the process going nowhere. Religious women were, I quote, great listeners. They understood the necessity and value of listening. They facilitated and supported a process of storytelling to help each side fully and properly understand the other at all levels. It was critical to shifting these meetings from a blame game to a process of sharing pain, recognizing the common humanity, and building trust on the basis of knowledge and understanding of each other. Now, most importantly, they brought to the negotiations a wholly different set of calculations to those of the belligerent parties. All the belligerents were occupied by cost-benefit analyses, complicated by intangibles such as honor, pride, and ideology. Belligerents fear appearing weak, hence a tendency to continue the conflict and the killing, even as talks are underway. It was the readiness of belligerents to sustain violence as something intended to maintain a show of strength, of conveying high resolve, and of course, avoiding reputational risk that was anathema to the women taking part. How can you keep killing? We're trying to achieve peace. So these intangibles meant nothing to them. For the religious women, whose main concern was making peace, and a just peace as well, that has to be added, a positive peace, who were deeply disturbed by the human cost of conflict. There was no cost-benefit analysis. Rather, as projects project participants who became party to the dialogue with paramilitaries freely conceded they brought with them, I quote, raw emotion and a sense of urgency. I quote again, we women mostly know that there isn't time for all this talking. There are lives at risk and there are things to be done. Let's get on with it. So we tended to cut to the quick, I think. Now, so in effect, women became a vital ingredient, as one of them put it, and I quote, that cut through an awful lot of the posturing. Now, the results were palpable. From religious women's entry into proceedings in the early 1990s, a more overt commitment to the peace process began to be seen. The emphasis in the discourse appreciably moved from victimhood to agency, with previous pretensions to idealism strategically replaced by perceptibly practical realism. Each side could be seen to become positively proactive instead of negatively reactive. The process had become something to be managed rather than resisted. Now, a key example was the Republican transition from physical force to constitutionalism. Now, that sisters and other religious women who were active during the Troubles should be no surprise, given their rich and complex histories, replete with struggles against violence, injustice, poverty, and oppression. However, it still remains the case that a focus on women, especially when the research and writing is done by women, is regarded as niche, something of interest to women, but not necessarily the wider historical community, and certainly not consequential. So we were delighted when our research was, now after some lobbying, I have to admit, on my part, accepted by Her Story for their Peace Heroines exhibition. Now, Her Story is an organisation, it's an Irish organisation that tells Irish women's stories through the arts via exhibitions, shows and education projects. Now, the exhibition was recently launched at Stormont and it's going to be touring Ireland over the coming years, and it's going to be in schools. So this is all entirely positive and it's exceedingly welcome. And please do take a look at their website. We'll send you the link again because they've done an absolutely splendid job. And you can actually see the clips that I was going to show on their website. So please do take a listen and look and get some sense of the power. So elated as I was by our inclusion in Her Story, it was only when an invitation came later this year to submit a chapter to the forthcoming Routledge Handbook of the Troubles, mainstream history, that I felt the research and its implications were at last being taken seriously and making a wider impact. And even more so when the editors responded positively to the submission as precisely what the volume needed. I knew it was. Now, there still remains a tremendous amount of work to be undertaken in this field. And very fortunately, we've been joined by Dr. Maria Power from the Las Casas Institute, who brings with her a wealth of knowledge and experience and contacts if we're to move forward into as yet unexplored areas and answer the range of questions that have been raised by the research to date. Now, in particular, we want to look at the critical work of religious women in the high security prisons that house paramilitaries who held influential positions within their respective organizations. And we've identified a number of areas as imperative to explore if we are to achieve the project's mission, which is to generate a fuller appreciation of religious women's capacity to bring communities together, to create safe spaces in which the powerless find voice and agency, while at the same time making connections between warring parties and forging relationships between opposing sides and across sectarian divides. I mean, I'm just trying to say they're playing a crucial role, and we need to understand that role, and it's applicable to all conflict situations all over the world. Now, working at the margins, religious women mattered. They made a substantial difference and they were consequential. The importance of their story epitomizes the inherent warning in Irish President Michael D. Higgins' reminder that in dealing with the legacy of the past, and I quote, a strategy of amnesia is simply not an option. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diane and Breach. So would anyone like to start with a question? Yeah.
The sisters' experiences of talking in history, have they really not talked more about this, and how did they find that experience? I mean, I do therapeutic in some respects, I'm just interested to
We need to repeat it for Zoom. Yes. The gist of the question was how the sisters and women religious found the experience of the oral history interview, and whether they found it therapeutic or traumatic. And I would add to that how ye dealt with it.
Thank you for the question. The thing about oral history, and when you're interviewing other people, is you're not there as a therapist. You're not there to heal. You're there to facilitate a listening space. You're there to document, put on a historical record what these women are saying. So it's you have to be detached. You have to step back, and no two interviews were the same. And that was the most fascinating thing, really. Themes came through as I spoke about trauma, but anyone who has lived in Northern Ireland society will have suffered it at some stage. You know, we all know what it's like. I know you lived in it too. So an element of it, some more than others. But it was the actual fact that trust, as I said, was a big issue. And the sisters may have found it cathartic to speak. But that, and all the better if they did. I hope they did feel like that, you know. But I think they felt it was important as well to contribute, to put on record. Yes, these things did happen. We're not looking for praise. It's not really about us. This isn't about us. It's to show what went on in schools, what went on the streets, what went on in the prisons. And you can't write and talk about things like that without recognizing that this had an awful impact on some of these women. And that's the reality of it. And, you know, enforced silences aren't good for anybody, you know. And so I think, really, to answer your question again, I think they may have found it cathartic, but it was an ability for them to express their faith, their mission, their ministry, and also their allegiance to their religious institutes was very important. They see themselves as communities. They don't stand alone. There's not one sister who says, I'm there on my own. They are faith-inspired and they're community-inspired people. And that's what came through in the interviews.
I'll have to repeat it for Zoom. So,
just to continue the conversation, I recently was able to click through Mary McAleese's own memoir. Yeah. Obviously a woman, obviously deeply involved in those decades in her own community in Belfast, and what struck me was just the quality of her writing in evoking situations with great detail, but not too much. My question maybe for your project is there any way that these women, some of them might be encouraged also to write their memoir or sort of an article, or
so the question for those on Zoom is there any way that these women religious might be encouraged to write their memoirs or some kind of article, so to put it down on paper?
The Mercy Sisters are themselves. The Mercy Sisters. Sorry, apologies. The Mercy Sisters, the Institute, are already, I think it's Sister Anne McQuaid, isn't it? Yes. And she has already started the process of recording her institute, the sisters' experiences in their lives during this time frame. So that's an ongoing project in the Mercies. Individual sisters have written, like Dominican Geraldine Smith has written quite a lot about her religious institute, the Dominicans, their work in peace and reconciliation globally, not just in Northern Ireland, but globally. And of course, we've got memoirs. You've got Sarah Clark, for example, who an Irish-born sister based in England, And she has written about her times and the struggles and the challenges she faced as a prison visitor to the Irish category A, sometimes prisoners over here in England. So there is record of this, but there needs to be more. You know, there definitely does.
Well, just in answer to that last point, because if you watch the, and I do hope you will watch the written seminars, you will see me at the end of virtually every single one saying precisely that. Please will you write this down? Please will you write an article? Please will you write a memoir, autobiography, whatever? And they just laugh. They just laugh completely. And to be quite honest, from our experience of trying to gather things, and as I said, the resistance to it. I mean, I think you know, you need to remember that when we started this project, the first thing you do is just ask people. And I was told, and Bridget told both of us, oh, this just didn't do anything. Because remember, it was focused on, oh, they didn't do anything. And interestingly, Maggie Scull, who wrote an award-winning book on the Catholic Church and the Troubles, was told exactly the same. And women might not have been in her book on the Catholic Church and the Troubles, and women are very important in the church, if she hadn't been told about our project. And she came to see us and is very generous about what we were trying to do. And also in response to what you were asking about therapeutic and the trauma. Part of your training as an oral historian is you mustn't re-traumatize people. So you have to be very careful what you ask. But I've got to be honest, we didn't realize we were entering into the realm of traumatizing people, because it started off, as I said, just a history from below. And because we didn't actually have any idea of the extent of their activities, and we're being told they didn't do very much, it was a revelation to us. But what I would say, because there were teams, you could see, and as I said, the very first witness seminar, only half the people who turned up actually would speak. I've had emails subsequently where they've actually said, thank you for doing this. And even women who have said, no, I won't participate, have said, but good luck with this project. It does need to be done. So there's been support. And I remember one witness seminar in particular, again, it with the focus was Sloan Sisters. One came along and she just said, no, I can't do it. And I said, well, look, just sit there and listen. You know, you're part of this, just listen. And in the second half, she came out and told a really moving story. And also about her fear, because I mean, I think that's something as well, that they're living with fear, as those communities were. You're living surrounded by fear, and they were often afraid, but they still did these things. They still did things, even though they knew it was dangerous work, very dirty, dangerous, messy work. Peace building is.
Cheers. Richard, would you?
Thank you both for really superb presentations and really important history that's being done. You spoke about the difficulty of having an audience for the good news because of, as it were, the bad news, in terms of, as it were, the Magdalen laundries and so on. Is there a problem for the historian in trying to understand how such bad things and such good things can come from the same part of the church?
So the question for those on Zoom is there a problem for the historian in understanding how such bad things, such as the Magdalen laundries, and such good things, such as the activism of the sisters, can come from the church?
Or the same part of the church?
Oh, sorry, the same part of the church.
Thank you. But this was a shock. This was a shock. I obviously am a historian, as Maria alluded to earlier on, a Cold War historian, and the Cold War is full of shadows, lots of grey areas, and there's no good side and there's no bad side, even though propaganda-wise it's presented as a conflict of good versus evil. And that was my whole mission in life, if you will, prior to this project, was to look at why it was presented that way, the role that religion played, both in creating it, but also in challenging it. So certainly for me, you could look at Vatican and high politics and involvement with state leaders and a sort of something that you don't expect as Christians. But at the same time, you had liberation theology. You had nuns and priests in Latin America being slaughtered because of the way that they were fighting for justice. and to alleviate poverty and all these various things. And this is why this was such a shock, because I, as a Cold War historian, wrote about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And nobody said, oh, you shouldn't be writing about that bit. You should only be writing about this bit. So this actually is totally counter to the historian's trade, totally counter. And that's why I mentioned in the paper, I really was not expecting that. So no, it usually isn't, but in this case, it really was.
Well, all I can say is from the very beginning and from the outset, in order to get religious sisters to speak, I had to be very clear that I was not going down the route of the Magdalen laundries or the historical abuse inquiries that were going on in Northern Ireland or throughout Ireland. I made it very clear from the beginning, because I knew that if I said I was going to ask questions on this, there wouldn't be an oral history project. That's, I mean, these sisters, quite rightly so, are quite guarded in what they have to say. They don't want to be misinterpreted. They don't want to be misquoted. And so, but on saying that, during the interviews, several sisters brought it up. So, you know, it's the authenticity of the oral history interview is called into question if you have to omit questions before you even go into the process, you know, but several sisters wanted it put on record. And one in particular said, talking about the tomb situation, you know, she said, she owned this, and she said, I want justice for these women and for their children at whatever cost. So I didn't go down that route. I just, other people, it's for other historians and other researchers, and they're doing it very well, I think, at the minute anyway.
Well, I just want to add to that bit, because I think it's important to stress it did start off as an oral history project, just to witness seminars, and Breed, as it were, evolved out of you became the project in a way, didn't you? But when we first started it was a project on the Troubles, as Breed said, it was the sisters who brought it up, even in those initial. They were the ones who felt that need, if you will, to bring it up. It didn't actually occur to me as a historian looking at the Troubles that even have to be covered. They were the ones, as Breach said, very rightly brought it up, not us. And I didn't think, oh, I must avoid this. It just wasn't part of what I was doing. It was like, if I'm looking at a Cold War, do I need to go back and look at the American Civil War? What's the relation?
Would anyone on Zoom like to ask a question? No? Are there any further questions? No? Well, thank you so much for coming, everyone. It's been a very good start to Las Casas' relationship with this project. And I'd like to thank Diane and Breach again for two, as Richard said, absolutely superb papers. So thank you. Yeah, I've never had anyone cry when I've given